What's his deal anyway? He can't just tell me to apply for a different high school at the snap of a moment. Even so, what can you do? He is our father. What's this? I thought you were my clone. Don't tell me you also have emotions? Of course I do. Now then, summon another and let's crush this entrance exam with perfect scores. Sure thing, let's do it.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 1, The Ordinary Mask. The morning sun bathed Crestwood High School in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the brick facade as students streamed through the gates. Ethan Walker walked among them, an easy smile on his face and a confident stride that made him seem like he had the world figured out. "Morning, Ethan." Mrs. Parker, the school secretary, called out from the office window. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker." "Love the new glasses," Ethan replied, his tone warm and genuine. A few feet away, a group of freshmen whispered animatedly, sneaking glances at him. One of them accidentally dropped their water bottle, and Ethan bent down to retrieve it. "Careful," he said, handing it back with a grin. "Wouldn't want you to go thirsty." The younger student stammered a thank you, while Ethan moved on, his presence leaving an impression as always. But his charm wasn't just a natural gift. It was carefully cultivated, a mask he wore daily. Ethan needed to be perfect, the reliable student, the friendly classmate, the unassuming teenager. And he was good at it. He made his way down the bustling hallway, exchanging nods and smiles with teachers and classmates alike. Near the lockers, Jenny Miller stood fiddling with her books, her gaze darting toward Ethan as he approached. "Today's the day," her friend whispered. "Just talk to him." "I can't," Jenny hissed back, but before she could say anything more, Ethan stopped nearby. She fumbled, her books slipping from her arms. They hit the floor with a loud thud. Ethan crouched to pick them up, handing them back with practiced ease. "You might want to hold on tighter to these." Yeah. "Thanks," Jenny managed, her cheeks flushed. "No problem," Ethan replied, his tone light. He lingered for a moment, offering her a reassuring smile, before continuing on his way. Jenny stared after him, her heart racing. For Ethan, it was just another interaction. Another way to keep up appearances. But as he reached his locker and spun the dial on his combination lock, the mask slipped for a brief moment. His fingers trembled slightly, a subtle hint of the turmoil he kept buried deep inside. Later, during chemistry class, Ethan found his thoughts wandering. Mr. Holcomb was droning on about the properties of acids and bases, but Ethan's focus was elsewhere. The sunlight streaming through the window reminded him of another time, another place, one he'd spent years trying to forget. The memory came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. He was 10 years old, sitting at the dining table, pencil in hand as he worked on his math homework. His younger brother, Jamie, was sprawled on the living room rug, playing with his favorite toy cars. Their parents had gone out for groceries, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet house. The first sign of trouble was the smell of smoke. "Jamie," Ethan had called out, his voice tinged with confusion. "Do you smell that?" Jamie looked up, his small face puzzled. That was when the flames erupted. The fire spread faster than Ethan could comprehend, engulfing the curtains and climbing the walls. Panic seized him as the heat intensified, the air thick with smoke. "Jamie, get over here!" Ethan screamed, rushing toward his brother. But the flames surged, cutting him off. He coughed, his lungs burning, and that was when it happened. A strange sensation coursed through his body, as if he were being pulled apart and put back together at the same time. For a split second, he felt as though he were in two places at once, one version of himself standing frozen by the table, the other reaching for Jamie. It was disorienting, terrifying. And then it was over. The firefighters arrived in a blur of sirens and shouting, pulling Ethan from the house. But Jamie hadn't made it. Ethan had discovered his power of duplication that day. But it hadn't saved the person who mattered most. The memory faded as Mr. Holcomb's voice brought Ethan back to the present. "Ethan, are you paying attention?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied automatically, masking the emotions swirling inside him. Ethan's carefully constructed routine continued through the day, but the cracks in his facade deepened. By lunchtime, he was sitting at his usual table in the cafeteria, surrounded by friends who were oblivious to his inner turmoil. "Are you coming to the game tonight?" one of them asked. "Probably," Ethan lied. He had no intention of going. He had more important things to do. Through the cafeteria window, something caught his eye: two unmarked white vans parked near the gymnasium. They looked out of place, their windows tinted, the engines idling. "Hey, Ethan," his friend said, nudging him. "You okay?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. Before he could think more about the vans, a deafening explosion rocked the building. The cafeteria windows rattled violently, and a plume of smoke rose from the direction of the gym. Panic erupted as students screamed and ducked under tables. "Everyone stay calm," a teacher yelled, though their own voices shook. Ethan's instincts kicked in. "Stay here," he told his friends, his tone firm. "What are you doing?" one of them asked. I urgently need to hit the washroom."
Bye.
He slipped out of the cafeteria, moving toward the source of the explosion. The hallways were chaotic, filled with frightened students and frantic teachers. When he reached the gym, the sight before him made his stomach drop. The doors were blown off their hinges, and debris littered the ground. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, and through the haze, Ethan saw two figures in dark clothing unloading crates from one of the vans. They moved with precision, their faces obscured by masks. Ethan ducked behind a corner, his mind racing. Who were they? What were they doing? He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to intervene. He couldn't risk exposing himself, not yet. The principal's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, ordering an immediate evacuation of the building. Ethan blended into the crowd of students streaming toward the parking lot, his face a mask of calm even as his thoughts churned. As he reached the parking lot, Jenny caught up to him. "Ethan," she called, breathless. "What happened? Did you see anything?" "No idea," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Probably a gas leak or something." Jenny frowned, her sharp eyes studying him. "But you ran toward the explosion. Why? How did she know?" Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Instinct. I thought someone might need help." Her frown deepened, but she didn't press further. That night, Ethan sat alone in his room, the town history book open on his desk. But his mind wasn't on the project. He flipped through a notebook filled with cryptic sketches and notes, a private record of the strange occurrences in Crestwood over the years. The explosion was just the latest in a series of events that didn't add up. "What are you hiding?" he murmured to himself, staring at the reflection in his window. The reflection stared back, silent but knowing. That evening, Ethan sat in his dimly lit room, replaying the day's events in his mind. The explosion wasn't random, it felt deliberate, calculated. His gut told him it was connected to the strange figures unloading crates near the gymnasium. But who were they? And what were they after? He glanced at his notebook, filled with scribbles about past incidents around Crestwood. Missing pets, strange lights in the woods, unexplained fires, he had always assumed they were unrelated anomalies. But today's explosion made him reconsider. The sound of muffled voices drifted up from the living room, snapping him out of his thoughts. His parents were watching the evening news. An explosion at Crestwood High School earlier today, the anchor reported. Authorities believe it may have been caused by a ruptured gas line. No injuries have been reported, but the investigation is ongoing. Ethan frowned. A gas leak? That was the official explanation? It was too convenient, too neat. He stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer outside. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt eerie rather than peaceful. Something's not right, he muttered. The next morning, Ethan arrived at school earlier than usual, his mind still preoccupied with unanswered questions. He found Jenny waiting for him at their designated meeting spot in the library. "Hey," she said, giving him a curious look. "You okay? You've been off." Ethan forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." They settled into their work, flipping through dusty books about Crestwood's history. Most of it was mundane, details about the town's founding, early settlers, and its evolution over the years. But one passage caught Ethan's attention. During the early 1900s, a series of mysterious disappearances plagued the town. Locals whispered about a hidden society operating in the shadows, though no evidence was ever found to support these claims. Ethan tapped the page. "What do you think about this?" Jenny leaned over to read, her brow furrowing. "A hidden society? Sounds like something out of a conspiracy theory." "Maybe," Ethan said, his tone neutral. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. By lunchtime, the school had returned to its usual rhythm, though the explosion was still a topic of hushed conversation. Ethan sat with his friends, nodding along to their chatter but staying mostly silent. His attention was drawn to the janitor's closet at the far end of the cafeteria. Two men in maintenance uniforms stood outside, speaking in low voices. Something about their demeanor struck him as odd, the way they glanced around nervously, the stiffness in their posture. Ethan excused himself and casually made his way toward the closet. He ducked into a nearby hallway, out of sight, and focused on the two men. This was the moment he hated most, the act of splitting. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he concentrated. A tingling sensation spread through his body, and then he felt it, a subtle shift, as though part of him had stepped forward while the rest remained behind. When he opened his eyes, his clone was standing beside him. Identical in every way, the duplicate nodded silently before heading toward the janitor's closet. Ethan stayed hidden, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Through the clone's eyes, he saw the two men disappear inside, leaving the door ajar. The clone slipped in after them, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cleaning chemicals, but that wasn't what caught the clone's attention. Against the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a metal case. One of the men crouched beside it, inputting a code into its keypad. The case clicked open, revealing several cylindrical devices that looked disturbingly like explosives. "What's the timeline?" one of the men asked. "Tonight," the other replied. "The van leaves at 10. We can't afford any delays." The clone stepped back silently, retreating toward the door. But just as it reached the hallway, one of the men turned, his eyes narrowing. "Wait. Did you hear that?" The clone dissolved before he could investigate further, leaving no trace of its presence. Back in the hallway, the original Ethan staggered slightly as the memories from his clone flooded his mind. Explosives. A van leaving at 10. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than I had thought. By the end of the school day, Ethan's mind was racing. He couldn't ignore what he'd seen. But what could he do? Calling the police wasn't an option, he had no evidence, and there was no way to explain how he'd gotten the information without exposing his secret. As he packed up his things, Jenny approached him. "Hey," she said. "Do you want to come over tonight? We can work on the project some more." Ethan hesitated. He needed to focus on stopping whatever the men were planning, but turning Jenny down might raise suspicion. "Sure," he said finally. "But I can only stay for a little while." Jenny smiled, seemingly satisfied with his answer. Later that evening, Ethan slipped out of his house under the guise of heading to Jenny's. Instead, he made his way to the industrial district on the outskirts of town, where he'd seen the unmarked vans parked the day before. The area was eerily quiet, the buildings casting long shadows in the fading light. Ethan kept to the edges, using the darkness to his advantage. When he finally spotted the van, his suspicions were confirmed. The same two men from earlier were loading the metal case into the back, their movements hurried and tense. Ethan clenched his fists. He couldn't let them leave. Summoning another clone, Ethan sent it toward the van while he stayed hidden. The clone moved swiftly, slipping into the back of the vehicle just as the men finished loading their cargo. The van's engine roared to life, and it pulled away from the curb. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Whatever these men were planning, he was now caught in the middle of it, and he was determined to stop them, no matter the cost.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 2, Duplication in Action. The next morning, Crestwood High buzzed with whispers about the gym explosion. Students speculated about what had happened, while teachers dismissed the incident as a mere accident. Ethan sat at his desk in first period history, flipping through his textbook but not absorbing a single word. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene from the night before, the two men, the explosives, and the unmarked van. "Ethan!" He blinked, realizing the teacher was calling his name. "Could you answer the question?" she asked, tapping the chalkboard where a timeline of Crestwood's founding was sketched. 1825, he guessed, grateful for the topic's familiarity. The teacher nodded, and Ethan exhaled in relief. At lunch, Ethan joined Jenny at their usual spot. She was scrolling through her phone, her brow furrowed. "Did you see this?" she asked, showing him an article about the gym explosion. The headline read, "Gas leak causes minor explosion at Crestwood High Gymnasium." "They're calling it a gas leak," Jenny said. "But look at this." She pointed to a paragraph buried in the article. "Officials have reported finding unusual traces of an unidentified substance at the site. Investigations are ongoing." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't just a gas leak. "That's weird," he said, feigning indifference. "Probably just something from the pipes." Jenny wasn't convinced. "You think so? It doesn't add up. And did you see those vans parked outside yesterday? They were gone before the fire department even arrived." Ethan forced a shrug, though her sharp observation unnerved him. Jenny was smart, too smart, and if she kept digging, she might uncover things he wasn't ready to explain. Later that evening, Ethan was alone in his room when his burner phone buzzed. The number was unlisted, as always. He answered, his voice low. "I'm here." The familiar, distorted voice on the other end wasted no time. "You saw the explosion?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ethan replied. Unusual activity was detected at the site, the voice continued. "You're to investigate. Tonight. Use your abilities if necessary." "Understood," he said finally, though his voice wavered. The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone, a mix of dread and determination settling over him. That night, Ethan left his house under the guise of meeting friends for a study session. In truth, he was heading back to the school. The campus was deserted, its darkened hallways and empty classrooms casting eerie shadows. The gym was cordoned off with yellow caution tape, but that didn't stop Ethan. He crouched behind a cluster of bushes, observing the security detail patrolling the perimeter. There were 2 guards, both wearing uniforms emblazoned with the logo of a private security firm. Ethan's heart pounded. Getting past them without drawing attention would be impossible, unless he used his power. He clenched his fists, a wave of unease washing over him. But he had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, Ethan focused on the guard nearest to him. He closed his eyes, feeling the familiar tingling sensation spread through his body. When he opened them, his clone stood beside him, identical in every way. The duplicate nodded silently before stepping into view. It stumbled deliberately, knocking over a trash can and cursing loudly. The noise drew the guard's attention instantly. "Hey! Who's there?" one of them shouted, rushing toward the commotion. The clone took off, leading the guards away from the gym's entrance. Ethan stayed hidden, waiting until the coast was clear before slipping inside. The air inside was heavy with the scent of burned wood and melted plastic. The explosion had left scorch marks along the walls, and debris was scattered across the floor. Ethan moved cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the wreckage. Near the center of the room, something caught his eye, a series of strange symbols etched into the floor. They were intricate and unfamiliar, glowing faintly as though imbued with some kind of energy. "What is this?" he muttered, crouching to get a closer look. As he examined the symbols, a low hum filled the air. It was coming from a device partially buried beneath the rubble. The device was sleek and metallic, pulsing with an otherworldly light. Ethan's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a gas leak or an accident, this was deliberate, and it was tied to something far beyond Crestwood. Before he could investigate further, the sound of footsteps echoed through the gym. Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" a voice called out. He recognized it immediately, Jenny. Ethan cursed under his breath. What was she doing here? His duplicate must have crossed paths with her, leading her to the gym. She was tenacious, and now she was dangerously close to uncovering his secret. "Ethan?" Jenny's voice grew louder as she approached. Thinking quickly, Ethan stepped out from behind a pile of debris, feigning nonchalance. "Jenny? What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said, crossing her arms. "I saw you sneaking around earlier, and then I thought I saw you twice." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Twice," he repeated, forcing a laugh. "That's crazy. You must have been seeing things." Jenny's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I know what I saw." Before Ethan could respond, the hum from the device grew louder. Jenny's attention shifted to it, her expression turning to one of curiosity. "What is that?" she asked, stepping closer. Ethan blocked her path. "You shouldn't be here, Jenny. It's not safe." "Not safe? What's going on, Ethan?" He opened his mouth to answer, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. "Someone's coming," he whispered, grabbing her arm. "We need to go. Now." Ethan tightened his grip on Jenny's arm, leading her toward the gym's side exit. The hum from the strange device grew louder, sending vibrations through the floor. "Oh my God! He is holding my hands." "Come on, Jenny, this isn't the time or place for having these thoughts." "Ethan, what's going on? What was that thing?" Jenny hissed as they darted behind a stack of overturned bleachers. her heart throbbing. He is so close to me. I don't know, Ethan whispered, glancing back toward the glowing symbols on the floor. But we need to get out before whoever planted it comes back. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by low murmurs. Ethan peeked through a crack in the bleachers and saw two figures enter the gym, their faces obscured by masks. The men carried devices resembling handheld scanners, which they used to analyze the symbols and the strange metallic object. Ethan felt Jenny tense beside him as she caught sight of them. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Not anyone we want to meet," Ethan replied. The men spoke in hushed tones, their words unintelligible. Then one of them turned toward the exit, barking something into a radio. "This is bad," Ethan muttered. He glanced at Jenny. "Stay here." "What?" "No way. I'm not letting you. Just stay quiet." Ethan snapped, his voice harsher than intended. Without waiting for her response, he slipped out from behind the bleachers. Ethan ducked into the shadows, summoning his duplicate once again. The process felt smoother this time, the tingling sensation less jarring. His clone appeared beside him, nodding silently before sprinting across the gym. The sudden movement caught the masked men's attention. "There," one of them shouted, raising his scanner. Ethan's clone zigzagged through the debris, knocking over a pile of chairs and drawing the men away from the device. The diversion worked, but only for a moment. One of the men turned back toward the symbols, barking orders into his radio. Ethan knew he needed more time. He gestured to his clone, silently directing it toward the metallic object. The clone understood, sprinting toward the device and yanking it free from the rubble. The hum ceased instantly, replaced by a deafening silence. "What did you do?" one of the masked men yelled, rushing toward the clone. The duplicate smirked, tossing the device into the air. As the men scrambled to catch it, the clone vanished in a puff of smoke. Ethan took advantage of the chaos, grabbing Jenny's hand and pulling her toward the exit. "We have to go," he said urgently. They burst into the cool night air, their breaths visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. Behind them, the gym doors slammed open, and the masked men gave chase. "This way!" Ethan shouted, leading Jenny down a narrow alley behind the school. "Ethan, how did you do that?" Jenny gasped, struggling to keep up. Later, he snapped, scanning the area for an escape route. Spotting a chain-link fence, he boosted Jenny over before scrambling up himself. The masked men were gaining on them, their footsteps echoing ominously. Just as one of the men reached the fence, Ethan kicked a trash can toward him, buying them a few precious seconds. "Keep running," Ethan urged, pulling Jenny along as they disappeared into the shadows. They didn't stop until they reached an abandoned park several blocks away near Jenny's home. Jenny collapsed onto a bench, struggling to catch her breath. "Okay," she panted. "Start talking." "What was that? Who were those guys? And what the hell was that thing in the gym?" Ethan paced nervously, debating how much to reveal. Jenny had already seen too much, and her curiosity was bound to lead her into even more danger. "I don't know who they were," he said finally, running a hand through his hair. "But whatever they wanted, it wasn't good. That's all for now.
Bye."
He ran towards his home, leaving Jenny behind. "Hey, Ethan, stop right now and explain yourself." As Ethan left the park, a dark SUV rolled slowly down the nearby street. Inside, one of the masked men watched them through tinted windows, speaking into a phone. "I've found the boy," he said. "And he's not alone." The SUV drove off, disappearing into the night. Back at the street, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, though he didn't know why. He turned back and looked at Jenny, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry, but you need to stay out of it," he thought to himself. Jenny glared at him. You think I'm just going to walk away after everything I've seen?
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 3, The Girl Who Knows Too Much. Ethan walked into school with the same calm, calculated demeanor he'd perfected over the years. On the surface, he was the ideal student, friendly, punctual, and composed. But under his mask, his mind raced. The events of the previous night still played on a loop in his head, the glowing symbols, the mysterious device, and Jenny witnessing his clone. He knew the danger wasn't over. Ethan. He flinched at the sound of Jenny's voice, turning to see her jogging toward him. We need to talk, she said firmly, grabbing his arm. Good morning to you too, Ethan replied with a nervous chuckle, trying to steer her toward a less crowded hallway. Jenny ignored his attempt at humor. Don't act like nothing happened. I saw you, both of you. Ethan's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. Jenny, you were probably just tired. It was dark, Anne. Don't, she interrupted, her eyes narrowing. I know what I saw, Ethan. You're not normal, are you? The hallway seemed quieter suddenly, as though the rest of the school had faded away. Ethan leaned in closer, his voice low. Can we not talk about this here? They slipped into an empty classroom, the silence between them heavy. Jenny crossed her arms, waiting for an explanation. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but... Stop lying, Jenny snapped. I saw you duplicate yourself. Twice. I'm not stupid, Ethan. He studied her for a moment, debating his options. If he kept denying it, she'd only dig deeper. But telling her the truth would put her at risk. It's not what you think, he said finally, opting for a half-truth. I have a gadget. But it's not something I talk about. Ever. Why not? She asked, her tone softening slightly. Because people like those guys from last night would do anything to get their hands on my gadget, Ethan replied. You saw how dangerous they are. Do you really want to be part of this? Jenny hesitated but didn't back down. I just want to understand. You don't have to face this alone, Ethan. Her words caught him off guard. For a moment, he considered trusting her completely. But the memory of his past losses held him back. Thanks, he said, forcing a smile. But I've got it under control. Despite Ethan's assurances, Jenny couldn't let the matter go. Throughout the day, she found herself watching him more closely, noting the small inconsistencies she'd overlooked before. During lunch, she noticed how Ethan seemed to anticipate things before they happened, catching a falling tray before it hit the ground, or moving out of the way before someone bumped into him. In chemistry class, she caught him doodling symbols in his notebook, similar to the ones from the gym. Her curiosity turned into determination. That evening, she combed through her own notes from their history project, hoping to find clues about the symbols or the device Ethan had discovered. Meanwhile, Ethan was having a hard time maintaining his double life. His mysterious handler had contacted him again, providing information about the symbols he'd seen. They belonged to an ancient group known as the Vanguard, a secretive organization rumored to have access to otherworldly technology. They've been operating for centuries, the handler had explained. Their goals are unclear, but their methods are ruthless. I think you should stay away from them, Ethan. Easier said than done, Ethan thought as he hung up. The Vanguard wasn't just a threat to him, they were a threat to the entire town. And ignoring them wasn't an option. But as he tried to focus on deciphering the symbols, his mind kept drifting back to Jenny. She'd seen too much, asked too many questions. Keeping her at arm's length was becoming harder by the day. The following afternoon, Jenny convinced Ethan to meet her in the library under the guise of working on their project. As they sifted through books about the town's history, she carefully steered the conversation toward the gym incident. "So," she said casually, "about last night?" Ethan tensed, keeping his eyes on the book in front of him. "What about it?" "Those symbols you found," Jenny continued, pretending to read. "Have you seen them before?" "Why would I have seen them before?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Jenny leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Because I saw your notebook, Ethan. The one with all those sketches." Ethan froze. His notebook, where he'd drawn the symbols to study them, was supposed to be hidden in his locker. "How did you?" "I was looking for our project notes," Jenny admitted. "Your locker was open, and I saw it by accident. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Those symbols mean something, don't they?" Ethan stared at her, caught between frustration and fear. He'd underestimated her determination. "They're just doodles," he said finally. Jenny raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then why do they match the ones from the gym?" As their conversation grew more intense, they didn't notice another pair of eyes watching them from across the library. Julie, Jenny's best friend, frowned as she observed their interaction. She'd always known Jenny had a soft spot for Ethan, but seeing them together like this stirred something in her. Later, as they walked home together, Julie couldn't hold back her thoughts any longer. "Why are you so obsessed with Ethan?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I'm not obsessed," Jenny replied defensively. Julie gave her a pointed look. "You're practically glued to his side lately. What's going on?" Jenny hesitated. She trusted Julie, but she wasn't sure how much to share. "It's complicated," she said finally. Julie sighed, her frustration evident. "Just be careful, okay? I know you like him, but he's not worth losing yourself over." Jenny stopped walking, startled by the bitterness in Julie's tone. "Is that what you think? That I'm just another girl with a crush?" Julie looked away, her jaw tight. "Maybe. Or maybe I just don't want to see you get hurt." The tension between them lingered as they continued their walk in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The weight of his secret pressed heavily on him, a burden he had carried alone for years. The last thing he needed was for Jenny to start piecing things together. His phone buzzed, a text from his mysterious handler flashing on the screen. "I told you not to get involved, but I know you are not going to sit idle. You got any lead?" Ethan replied back. "They're closer than we thought. Be ready." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, then tossed the phone onto his desk. The threat from the Shadow Vanguard was no longer just a distant possibility, it was real, and it was coming for him. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the danger, his mind kept drifting back to Jenny. He wasn't sure what it was about her that made him want to protect her, but he couldn't deny it. The fact that she was getting closer to the truth terrified him. And yet, despite the constant threat looming over them both, he couldn't bring himself to push her away. The next morning, Jenny arrived at school early, her mind made up. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan than he was letting on. The symbols, the strange behavior, everything pointed to something much larger than just a high school student. She found herself standing outside Ethan's locker, glancing up and down the hallway to make sure no one was watching. With a deep breath, she pulled the lock open. The moment she stepped inside, her heart raced. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find, but she had a gut feeling that the answer was here. As she rifled through Ethan's things, she felt a surge of guilt. Was she invading his privacy? But then her fingers brushed against something that made her pause, a thick notebook, its pages filled with strange sketches and notes. The symbols from the gym, the ones Ethan had drawn in his notebook, were on these pages too. Jenny flipped through the notebook quickly, her pulse quickening as she found more details, more strange symbols. This wasn't just some random doodles, it was a map. A map of places in town, locations marked with the same symbols she had seen before. Suddenly, a voice behind her broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Jenny spun around to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his eyes cold and unreadable. Ethan stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable. Jenny started, but Ethan cut her off. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. Jenny didn't back down. "Why? What's going on, Ethan? What are you hiding?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the notebook in Jenny's hands. "It's not what you think." Jenny shook her head. "I don't think you understand. I've been trying to give you the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not stupid. I know you're not who you say you are. Your strange power, and now you've got some map with these strange symbols, and I don't know what to make of it, but I can't ignore it anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened. He hadn't anticipated Jenny pushing this hard. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. She was a risk, one that could expose everything. "I'm not your enemy," Jenny added, her voice softer now. "I just want to understand. I thought we were friends." Ethan's heart clenched. She didn't know the half of it. "I'm trying to protect you, Jenny," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And that's why you need to stay away from all of this." But it was already too late. The curiosity, the drive to uncover the truth, it was all consuming her now. "I won't back off," Jenny said, her eyes fierce. "Not until I know what's going on." Ethan could see the determination in her eyes, and for the first time, he realized just how much of a threat she was to his carefully constructed world. As Jenny walked home that afternoon, her mind was spinning. Ethan had admitted to something, but he hadn't come clean. There was more to the story than he was letting on. But what? And why was she so drawn to the mystery of it all? Her thoughts were interrupted when Julie caught up with her. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" Julie asked, her tone flat. Jenny sighed. "I can't help it. He's hiding something. I can feel it." "I told you to be careful," Julie muttered, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening. "He's not worth all of this. I don't care how cute he is." Jenny felt a pang of frustration. "This isn't about that. This is about something bigger." Julie shook her head. "Jenny, I get it, okay? You're obsessed with him. But you don't know what you're dealing with. What if he's dangerous?" "I don't think he is," Jenny said, though she wasn't as sure as she wanted to be. Julie stopped walking, her face tight with frustration. "You don't know that. I just don't want to see you hurt. Julie, you're my best friend. I need you to understand." But Julie wasn't listening. She turned on her heel and walked off, leaving Jenny standing alone on the sidewalk, feeling more uncertain than ever. As the evening descended on the town, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the map in front of him. He had traced several of the symbols back to old underground locations scattered throughout the town, hidden places tied to the Shadow Vanguard's influence. The group wasn't just operating in the shadows, they were woven into the very fabric of the town's history. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. The message was from his handler. "They've noticed you. Be careful, Ethan. They know you're looking." Ethan clenched his fists, the weight of his dual life pressing down on him harder than ever. Jenny was getting closer to the truth, and the shadow vanguard was closing in on him. He had no choice but to keep playing the game, to keep lying. But deep down, he knew he couldn't do it forever.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 4, The Escalation. Ethan's senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the shadows as he walked home that evening. The town seemed eerily quiet, the soft hum of streetlights casting long, stretching shadows over the empty sidewalks. Ethan had always been aware of his surroundings, too aware, in fact, but tonight, there was something different. Something is wrong. It had started subtly. A figure in the distance, just standing there, watching. Then another, lurking at the edge of his vision. He tried to shake off the feeling of paranoia, but the figures didn't disappear. They were shadows, indistinct but undeniably present. Ethan quickened his pace, moving faster without consciously thinking about it. He passed his usual shortcuts, the alleyways he'd become familiar with, but the figures were still there. Following him. It wasn't until he reached his house that he saw him, the man. The figure stepped out of the darkness as Ethan reached his front porch. Clad in a long coat and wearing a black mask, the man's face was obscured, but his presence felt like a weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. There was a menace in his calm demeanor. "You've been careless, boy," the man said, his voice low, controlled. Ethan instinctively stepped back, but the man blocked his path. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if Ethan's question was inconsequential. "That's not important. What's important is that you're playing a dangerous game." Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't prepared for this. He had expected the shadow vanguard to stay in the shadows for a while longer, but now they were here, at his doorstep. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady, but he knew it was futile. The man already knew. "Don't play coy with me, Ethan," the man said with a cold smile. "We know about your little trick. And we know you've been poking around in places you shouldn't be." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want?" The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Cooperate, and we'll leave you and your loved ones alone. Keep fighting us, and we will make sure they pay the price. You've already seen what we're capable of." Ethan's stomach clenched. He had seen enough destruction, enough death to know the kind of terror the shadow vanguard could bring. His mind raced, but there was no immediate way out. "What do you need me to do?" Ethan asked, though he hated himself for asking. The man nodded, as if he had been expecting the question. "You'll find out soon enough. But know this, Ethan, every step you take in the wrong direction brings you closer to their death. People with certain abilities are naturally part of the hidden society, and you are no exception to it." With that, the man turned and melted back into the darkness. Ethan stood frozen, his body tense with the weight of the threat. His mind couldn't fully grasp it, but his gut told him one thing: he was running out of time. That night, Ethan went straight to his room. He couldn't afford to waste any time. If he was going to stand a chance against the shadow vanguard, he needed to understand his powers more than he ever had. He had used his duplication ability before, but never in a critical situation. Tonight, he'd have to push it to its limits. He focused intently on the task at hand. He could feel the familiar tug at the edges of his consciousness as his power stirred within him. He created one clone, then two, and then three. It felt natural, almost effortless, but as the clones appeared, Ethan's confidence waned. He tried to assign each of them a task. One to research, one to keep watch, and one to test the limits of the Shadow Vanguard's movements in town. But almost immediately, his power faltered. The clone he assigned to research dissolved the moment it attempted to read through a file. The second clone, meant for surveillance, fizzled out after a few minutes of standing still. The third one, meant for diversion, vanished the moment it encountered something that required more than just physical presence. Frustration built within him as he watched his clones vanish into nothingness. He had relied on them for so long, but he was realizing just how fragile his abilities were. What the hell? Ethan muttered under his breath. Little trick, huh? I think he was right. He had always been able to create clones with ease, but now it was as if his power was beginning to slip through his fingers. He couldn't use them for complex tasks, not simultaneously. They couldn't work together or handle more than one assignment. Each clone could only complete a single task before it collapsed. Ethan clenched his fists. This was a problem. The next day, Ethan knew he had to be strategic about how he used his abilities. The Shadow Vanguard was closing in, and time was running out. He couldn't afford to waste his clones on meaningless tasks. He began planning meticulously, assigning each clone one specific duty. The first clone would be in charge of surveillance, keeping watch over the school and any unusual activity. The second clone would research the Shadow Vanguard, trying to dig up information about their organization and operations. The third clone would serve as a diversion, drawing attention away from Ethan whenever the need arose. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was the only one he could manage with the limitations of his power. Each clone would work independently, without interference from the others. It wasn't ideal, but Ethan was used to working within constraints. As the day wore on, he felt his plan taking shape. He needed to gather more information that could help him predict what the Vanguard's next move would be. They were targeting the school, that much was clear. He couldn't risk them attacking during the annual fair, the consequences would be catastrophic. As he surveyed his notes, his clone handling surveillance returned with valuable intel. The Vanguard was already planning something. There had been talk about attacking the fair, using it as a cover for a larger operation. Ethan's gut twisted. He couldn't let that happen. While Ethan struggled to manage the growing threat around him, someone else was also piecing things together, someone far too close for comfort. Jenny had been following him for weeks, ever since that night when she had seen him, or rather, two versions of him. It had been the strangest, most confusing experience of her life. She had tried to convince herself it was a mistake, a trick of the light, or her imagination running wild, but deep down, she knew the truth: Ethan wasn't who he seemed to be. She had to know more. That evening, Jenny tailed Ethan once again. She had grown skilled at staying unnoticed, blending in with the crowd. She didn't know what she expected to find, but the need for answers gnawed at her. Ethan had been acting differently lately, avoiding her, disappearing at odd hours. Tonight, she wasn't going to let him slip away. She followed him through the streets of their quiet neighborhood, noting how he constantly checked over his shoulder, his gaze darting back and forth. He was on edge. The closer she got, the more certain she became that he was hiding something. Then, just as she turned a corner to keep him in sight, she froze. A tall figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking Ethan's path. The man was tall, wearing a long, dark coat, his face obscured by a mask. Ethan stiffened, and Jenny, heart-pounding, instinctively moved closer, hoping she could hear what was being said. She stayed hidden behind a row of bushes, peeking through the leaves, every muscle tense with fear. "Did you think you could escape?" the man's voice rang out, low and threatening. Ethan's voice followed, but Jenny couldn't hear his words clearly, only the tension in his tone. She took a small step forward, trying to hear better, when her foot scraped against the ground. The sound was slight, but enough to catch the man's attention. Her heart skipped a beat. Had he heard her? She barely had time to react before she saw the man's head whip around, his eyes scanning the area. Jenny pulled back, holding her breath, praying he hadn't spotted her. She didn't dare move. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the man turned back to Ethan. "Don't do anything stupid." His voice was a cold, final warning. Without another word, the man melted back into the shadows. Ethan watched him go, his body tense. He then looked around, as if sensing someone else had been there. Jenny quickly ducked down, holding her breath. After a few moments, Ethan walked away, his steps quick and purposeful. Jenny waited a little longer, her pulse still racing, before standing up. What had just happened? Was Ethan in danger? Or was he in on something far worse than she had imagined? The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Ethan could feel the clock ticking down as the annual fair drew nearer. His clones continued to provide him with the intel he desperately needed, and he quickly realized that the Vanguard wasn't just planning an attack, it was going to be far more elaborate. The fair, a time of celebration for the town, was going to be the perfect cover for their operation. There would be crowds everywhere, distractions, chaos. The Vanguard could strike without anyone noticing until it was too late. Ethan had no choice but to act, and this time, he would have to do it alone. He had spent hours studying his clones' reports, piecing together the Vanguard's plan, and it was worse than he had feared. There were multiple points of entry to the fairground, all of them monitored by Vanguard agents. They had already infiltrated the event's security, blending in as workers, vendors, and performers. Ethan couldn't risk getting caught, not now. He had to shut them down before they made their move. He made the decision to split up his clones, assigning each one a critical task. One clone would take down the surveillance systems around the fairground. Another would sabotage any communication between the Vanguard agents. The third would plant false intel to mislead the Vanguard into thinking they were already exposed. Each clone was essential for the plan to succeed. Ethan knew it was risky. If any clone failed, the entire operation would collapse. But he didn't have time for second guessing. The Vanguard wasn't waiting for him to be ready, they were closing in, and he had to be ready first. As he stood on the edge of the fairground, the lights of the Ferris wheel flickering in the distance, Ethan took a deep breath. His mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. Tonight, everything changes. But Jenny wasn't far behind. She hadn't stopped thinking about the confrontation she had witnessed between Ethan and the masked man. She couldn't explain why, but something about Ethan's reaction had felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was hiding something bigger than she could imagine. The next day, she decided to confront him once more. She had to know the truth. She caught up with Ethan after school, as he hurried out the back door of the building, his face grim. "Ethan," she called, her voice steady but with an underlying tension. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Jenny, I'm busy." "Busy? Doing what?" "Who were those men you were talking to the other night?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. He wasn't going to lie to her again. He had already done that too many times. I can't explain it right now." His voice was strained. "But I promise, I'll tell you everything, just not now." "It's not safe." "Not safe?" "Ethan, you've been acting strange ever since we started this project. I need to know what's going on." He turned around, facing her for the first time. His expression was conflicted. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks, two figures watching them from across the parking lot. Ethan's heart skipped. The Vanguard were watching him.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 5, Night of the Showdown. The scent of cotton candy and the sound of laughter filled the air as the town gathered for the annual school fair. Colorful lights flashed from the Ferris wheel, casting long, stretched-out shadows on the grass beneath. The merry sounds of carnival games, people shouting in excitement, and music from the band created a festive atmosphere, but Ethan wasn't here to enjoy the fair. He kept to the outskirts, his eyes scanning the crowd. Every laugh, every cheer, every footstep felt like it could be a step closer to disaster. The Vanguard was closing in, and the fair was the perfect cover for their operation. Ethan knew the importance of staying alert, watching for any signs of trouble. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now. Although it was taking a toll on his body, his clones, each stationed at different points, were working tirelessly, keeping tabs on everything. One clone monitored the perimeter, watching for any suspicious activity. Another was inside the fairground, infiltrating the vendors and performers to see if any of them were Vanguard agents in disguise. The third clone was observing the security personnel, making sure their surveillance systems remained offline. Though his clones worked efficiently, Ethan knew that every task they took on only added more pressure. Each mission was a race against time, and he had to keep moving, keep adjusting. His power was unpredictable, and there was a chance that any of his clones could falter, or worse, be exposed. The danger was real, and Ethan had to balance keeping his secret from Jenny with the urgency of stopping the Vanguard's plan. Jenny, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the looming threat. She wandered the fairgrounds, still trying to piece together the mystery of Ethan's behavior. She noticed the way he kept glancing around, his brow furrowed, the way he spoke in vague, cryptic terms. But she couldn't help but be drawn to him. Her curiosity was stronger than her caution. As much as Ethan pushed her away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important from her, something much bigger than she could ever imagine. The night progressed, and just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the attack began. The first sign of trouble was a sudden blackout that plunged the entire fairground into darkness. The laughter stopped. The music cut out. A shiver of panic spread through the crowd as people began to look around nervously, unsure of what was happening. Ethan's heart raced. He could feel it, the Vanguard was here. He immediately activated his clones. One took its position near the entrance, surveying the crowd for any agents who might be infiltrating the fair. Another clone rushed to the center, ready to engage any attackers who would target civilians. The third clone moved to the backstage area, making sure that the Vanguard hadn't already infiltrated the security systems. Blood started pouring out from his left eye as Ethan's senses heightened. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. In the chaos of the blackout, he knew the Vanguard would make their move. It happened faster than he expected. From the shadows emerged several masked figures, their movements swift and calculated. They were well organized, clearly trained to execute an operation like this. Within moments, they started to strike, taking down anyone who got in their way. Some of them had weapons, while others used specialized gadgets to disable security systems and cause panic. The Vanguard's attack was swift and brutal. Ethan's clone at the entrance immediately sprang into action, leaping into the fray to protect a group of frightened children who were caught in the middle of the chaos. The Vanguard agents were quick, but Ethan's clone was prepared. He dodged their attacks with ease, using his strength and agility to overpower one of them. Another clone engaged in a high-speed chase, tracking down Vanguard agents who were fleeing into the darkness. The tension escalated with each passing second. Ethan fought to maintain control, his clones keeping the Vanguard at bay. But he was stretched thin, his mind scrambling to stay one step ahead. Every clone was valuable, but they weren't invincible. He had to keep them alive, but how long could they last against the overwhelming force of the Vanguard? His heart pounded as he surveyed the scene. The fairground was now a battleground. People screamed in fear, running for cover as the masked attackers moved like shadows through the crowd. Ethan's mind raced. How could he save them all? How could he stop the Vanguard without revealing himself? Just as it seemed the Vanguard was getting the upper hand, a powerful figure stepped forward. This man, taller than the others, exuded an intimidating aura. His black cloak billowed behind him as he walked, his eyes hidden beneath a mask that reflected the dim lights of the fairground. The moment he appeared, the remaining Vanguard agents paused, as if waiting for his orders. Ethan's clone, trying to stop him, collided with the figure in a flash of motion. The clone's punch landed squarely on the man's chest, but it had no effect. The figure didn't even flinch. He simply raised his hand, and with a flick of his fingers, the clone's body jerked back, sending it crashing into a booth. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as he watched the Vanguard leader approach. This was no ordinary adversary. This man was powerful, just as powerful as Ethan himself. "Ethan," the Vanguard leader said in a low, menacing voice. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. We've told you not to interfere." Ethan's clone braced himself, but he knew that this wasn't a fight he could win. The Vanguard leader's power was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The man continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You don't even know what we are doing? Am I correct? I think your power would be better used in our hands." Ethan's heart raced. His clones had always been his safety net, but now that safety was gone. The Vanguard had him in their sights, and they weren't about to let him slip away. Before Ethan could react, the Vanguard leader raised his hand, and a wave of energy surged through the air. The ground trembled beneath them, and the very air seemed to crackle with tension. Just as the energy blast was about to hit, a loud noise cut through the chaos, a distraction that caught the Vanguard off guard. Jenny, in her determination to help, had thrown something onto the stage. It was a smoke bomb. The thick cloud of smoke engulfed the area, obscuring Ethan and the leader from view. In that moment of confusion, Ethan found himself with an opportunity, one that could turn the tide of the battle. The thick cloud of smoke swirled around Ethan, concealing his movements from the Vanguard leader and the remaining agents. Ethan's pulse raced in the disorienting haze. His clone, which had been incapacitated by the Vanguard leader, slowly started to recover, shaking off the effects of the attack. Ethan knew he had to act quickly. But as the smoke lingered, he heard footsteps, a figure moving cautiously through the mist. His instincts told him to stay still, to wait, but the sound grew louder, closer. Was it one of the Vanguard agents coming to finish what they started? And what are they trying to do by involving this many innocent people in town? Then he heard a voice, soft but determined. "Ethan." It was Jenny. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced to process the situation. How did she get here? What was she doing? "Jenny, get back," he called out, his voice urgent, his mind frantic. This wasn't a place for her. She shouldn't be here. She didn't know what she was walking into. But it was too late. Jenny, driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, had already moved closer to the center of the fairground, where the confrontation was taking place. Her gaze flickered around, trying to make sense of the scene through the thick cloud of smoke. She could barely make out Ethan's silhouette through the haze. "I'm not leaving you, Ethan," she called back, her voice unwavering. Ethan felt a wave of conflicting emotions crash over him. He wanted to protect her, to send her away, but there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't going anywhere. She had seen too much already, and now, she was willing to put herself at risk. Her courage was undeniable. As the smoke began to clear, Ethan saw the Vanguard leader standing in front of him again, his hand still raised, ready to unleash his power. But before he could react, something unexpected happened. Jenny, with a sudden burst of bravery, grabbed a nearby metal signpost and swung it toward the Vanguard leader. The makeshift weapon caught the leader off guard, knocking him slightly off balance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to create an opening. Ethan seized the moment. His clone, now fully recovered, lunged at the Vanguard leader, tackling him to the ground. The force of the impact sent the leader sprawling, temporarily disoriented. The Vanguard agents, distracted by the turn of events, hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Ethan to capitalize on their momentary weakness. His remaining clones launched into action, engaging the other agents in a whirlwind of strategic combat. Each clone took on a specific role, overwhelming their opponents one by one. But despite the confusion, Ethan knew this wasn't the end. The Vanguard leader wasn't down for long. The man was too powerful to stay defeated for long, and Ethan had already learned how resilient he was. The Vanguard leader slowly rose to his feet, wiping the dirt and dust from his cloak. His mask cracked slightly, revealing a cold, calculating expression beneath. His hands clenched into fists, and Ethan could see the power building within him, crackling in the air around them. "You've made a mistake," the Vanguard leader snarled. "You think you can hide from us, Ethan? You think you can stop what's coming? You're nothing but a pawn." Pawn. "It's true that I don't know about your intentions, but even if I heard it, I don't think I would let you get away after hurting so many innocent bystanders throughout the years." Ethan's clone moved to engage again, but the leader raised his hand with a flick of his wrist, and the clone froze mid-motion. Energy radiated from the leader, a dark, unnatural force that ripped through the air and caused Ethan's clone to disintegrate into nothingness. Ethan gritted his teeth, fury rising within him. This was no longer just about protecting his secret, it was about survival. The Vanguard not only just wanted to do what they came here to do, but they also wanted to control him. They wanted his abilities. And they would stop at nothing to get them. With a roar, Ethan charged forward, his remaining clones flanking him. But the Vanguard leader was ready. He waved his hand again, and a wave of energy surged toward Ethan, sending him flying backward. His body slammed into the side of a carnival booth, pain shooting through him. "Ethan!" Jenny screamed. She moved toward him, but Ethan gripped her arm, pulling her back. "Stay back. This isn't your fight." But Jenny was persistent. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to do this alone." Ethan's chest tightened with frustration. But in that moment, he saw something in Jenny's eyes, a glimpse of understanding. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. The Vanguard leader chuckled darkly, his voice full of scorn. "You think you can win, Ethan? You can't even control your own powers. You're nothing without us. Let me tell you why we are here. Today is the Carnival Fest. The more sacrifices you make during this time, the stronger and powerful you will become by the blessings of God. It's still not too late to join our side voluntarily." Ethan looked around him, many people lying on the ground lifeless and more continuing to fall. "Sacrifices, huh? So that's your goal?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The leader's words stung, but they also ignited something in him, a fire he hadn't felt before. He had been hiding for so long, afraid to use his full potential. But now, with Jenny by his side and the Vanguard threatening everything he cared about, the school, friends, teachers, and the students with their parents, Ethan knew it was time to fight with everything he had. Ethan's clones reformed, each one more determined than before. He had no choice but to use his abilities to their fullest. He could no longer afford to hold back. His clones moved as one, working together to create a unified strategy. They flanked the Vanguard leader, keeping him distracted while Ethan focused all his energy on him. The Vanguard leader sneered, but his expression faltered for just a second, long enough for Ethan to land a powerful blow. The shock of the impact sent the leader stumbling backward, his hands raised to defend himself. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his strength. This was it. He knew his clones couldn't hold the Vanguard leader off for long, but with Jenny's unexpected assistance and his own resolve, he could defeat him. The battle raged on, each moment filled with tension, each move calculated. The Vanguard leader's attacks grew more desperate, more erratic. He was no longer focused on strategy, he was focused on vengeance. And in that desperation, Ethan saw an opening. He lunged forward, pushing past his clone's defenses, and struck the leader in a single, decisive move. The energy around the leader cracked and fractured, and with a final, anguished cry, the Vanguard leader collapsed to the ground. His mask shattered, revealing his true identity, a man who had once been just like Ethan, a man who had once used powers for good but had been consumed by the Vanguard's influence. Seeing Ethan defeat the Vanguard leader, his minions flew as quickly as possible. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The Vanguard would come again. But for now, he had won this fight. But why did the authorities haven't caught on to them? Or are they also involved in this fiasco? I need to look deeper into this matter and find new allies to protect this town and the families within. As the smoke cleared, Ethan turned to Jenny, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere. Jenny gave him a faint smile, her eyes still wide with disbelief. "I didn't think you were the hero type." Ethan's lips curved into a brief smile, but he knew better than to call himself a hero. He wasn't the one who had saved the day. They both
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 6, Facing the Past. The dimly lit room was silent except for the low hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Ethan stood over the Vanguard agent, who was shackled to a steel chair, his eyes wide with fear. Ethan had been ruthless in his approach, using a combination of his clones and strategic intimidation to capture the agent after the showdown at the fair. Now, standing in front of the man, Ethan's mind raced, trying to connect the dots between the Vanguard and the tragedy that had shaped his life. "Talk," Ethan growled, his voice cold. The agent's eyes darted around the room, clearly calculating his chances of escape. But Ethan wasn't going to give him that opportunity. Not anymore. The agent swallowed hard, his lips trembling. He was no longer the confident soldier he had been moments ago. Now, he was just a man caught in the web of secrets and lies. "You think this is over?" the agent sneered. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into. I don't care about your cryptic words. I need answers," Ethan snapped, stepping closer to the agent. His eyes locked with the agent's, his resolve firm. The agent's defiance faltered as Ethan's clones circled the room, waiting for a command to strike. There was no escape for him. He knew it. But still, he hesitated, clearly struggling with what to reveal. "Who are you working for?" Ethan demanded. "What's your connection to the fire?" "My brother died because of that explosion. It was no accident." The agent's expression shifted, no longer mocking. Instead, his lips tightened, and for a moment, he seemed to lose himself in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "The Vanguard, we were behind the fire. We were conducting experiments on children. Your brother, he was part of our project." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered in his chest as the agent's words reverberated in his mind. His brother had been part of it all? The fire that had shattered his life, the one thing that had driven him into hiding, was it all connected to the Vanguard? You killed him, Ethan said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with anger and grief. The agent didn't respond, his eyes lowering to the floor. Ethan could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under the realization that everything he thought he knew about that night had been a lie. The fire was supposed to be an accident, the agent continued, his tone less defiant now, more resigned. But something went wrong. Your brother, he was never supposed to be caught in the flames. We were testing the limits of the duplication process. He was one of the subjects. And you, he paused, meeting Ethan's eyes again. You were the success. You survived. That's why they came after you. Ethan's mind reeled. The fire, the loss of his brother, it had all been part of some twisted experiment? And somehow, he had become the key to it all, the one who had survived when others hadn't. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, his chest tight with a mixture of rage and sorrow. He had been living in the shadow of his brother's death for years, haunted by guilt and unanswered questions. And now, the truth came crashing down, raw and unrelenting. The Vanguard had been responsible for his brother's death. But why? What had they been trying to accomplish? And what was their ultimate goal? The agent's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. The Vanguard is bigger than you think. It's not just about the powers, it's about control. You're part of something much larger, something that's been in motion for years by the power of God. Ethan's mind whirled with possibilities. The Vanguard wasn't just a group of rogue agents, it was a shadow organization, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And now, he was at the center of it all, with his powers making him a target. But before he could press the agent for more information, the door to the room opened with a sharp creak. Jenny stepped inside, her expression worried but determined. She had been waiting outside while Ethan conducted the interrogation, but now, seeing the look on his face, she knew something had shifted. Ethan, she said softly, her voice a mix of concern and understanding. What's going on? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the agent, his fists clenched at his sides. The agent's eyes flickered nervously as Jenny stepped closer, sensing the tension in the room. Ethan opened his mouth to speak but then closed it again. He wasn't sure what to say, how to explain everything that was unraveling. Finally, he looked at Jenny, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. It was them. The Vanguard. They were behind the fire. They killed my brother, they tried to kill everyone today. And now they're after me because of my powers. Jenny's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching out to him. Ethan, I'm so sorry. Ethan shook his head, the anger rising within him again. Sorry? It doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring him back. It doesn't undo what they did. He turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Everything I've done, every step I've taken, it's all because of them. They made me who I am. And I hate it. Jenny stepped closer, her presence offering a sense of calm amidst the storm raging inside him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of his grief and frustration press down on him. He had been holding it all in for so long, not allowing himself to grieve, not allowing himself to acknowledge the pain of his past. Now, with the truth exposed, it felt like the dam had finally broken. He turned to face her, his eyes red with emotion. I don't know what to do, Jenny. I'm not a hero. I'm just a kid who got caught up in something bigger than me. Jenny's expression softened, and she pulled him into a quiet hug. It wasn't the grand gesture of a romance novel, but it was enough to ground him. In that moment, he allowed himself to lean on her, to let the weight of his emotions spill out. "You're not alone, Ethan," she whispered. "I'm here. We'll figure this out together." The comfort of her words brought a sense of relief, but Ethan knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The Vanguard wasn't going to stop just because he had discovered their secrets and stopped their plan today. And as much as he wanted to hide from the truth, he realized that there was no escaping it now. The past had caught up with him, and there was no turning back. The police came in and took the Vanguard leader with them. The siren of the ambulance rang in Ethan's ear while he sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor as he let the words from the Vanguard agent echo in his mind over the noises outside. His thoughts were clouded with grief and rage. His brother's death, the fire that had stolen so much from him, and the death of multiple people in front of him today, it all felt like a distant nightmare he had never fully woken up from. And now, the truth had shattered what little peace he had left. But Jenny's presence beside him, steady and unwavering, offered him something that no amount of anger could provide: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from blind optimism, but the kind that came from shared resolve and the promise of standing together in the face of overwhelming darkness. "I didn't ask for this," Ethan muttered, his voice raw. "I didn't ask to be the person they wanted me to be. I didn't ask to have these powers." Jenny squeezed his shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "No, you didn't ask for it. But you have them. And you can choose what you do with them. You don't have to become what they want. You can be more than just their weapon." Ethan met her gaze, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. Her words gave him something to hold on to, a flicker of clarity in the storm of confusion that had taken over his mind. He had spent so long running from his abilities, hiding from the truth, but now, with Jenny standing beside him, he realized that running away from his past wasn't going to protect him or anyone else. He stood up, pacing the room as he thought through everything he had learned. "The Vanguard wants me for my abilities. They want to use me. And they've been pulling strings for years, manipulating everything. But why? What do they want with me? Why all the secrecy?" Jenny's brow furrowed in thought. "There's something bigger going on. They're not just after you, they're after something more. And if they've been working on this for so long, they must have a plan." Ethan's mind raced. The Vanguard had ties to his past, to the fire that had consumed everything he had once known. But they were also tied to something much more sinister, something that threatened the very foundation of his town or even the world itself. "What if they're building an army?" he asked, more to himself than to Jenny. "What if they're using people like me to create something more?" Jenny's eyes widened as the gravity of his words hit her. She nodded slowly, her expression grim. "That's possible. If they've been experimenting on kids, testing their abilities, then it's not just about you. It's about creating a new generation of power." Ethan's thoughts shifted. He knew the Vanguard wasn't just after him because of his abilities, they were after something much more dangerous. The duplicates, his power of creation, they weren't just a weapon for them to wield. They were a tool for something larger, something more insidious. "They're trying to control everything," Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "And I won't let them." He turned away from Jenny, pacing again. His emotions, raw and uncontained, surged within him. His brother's death, the lies, the manipulation, it had all been part of their plan, part of their twisted experiment. The fire hadn't been an accident, it had been a calculated move in their twisted agenda. But no more. "I wouldn't allow them to control my life, to control my future. And moreover, I won't be their pawn." "You don't have to do this alone," Jenny said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "I'm here. We're in this together. Whatever they want, we can stop them. But we have to fight." Ethan turned to face her, his expression softening. Her unwavering faith in him, in their ability to make a difference, was something he hadn't expected. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that mattered. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan admitted, his voice shaky. "I'm just one person. And they're everywhere. The Vanguard is too powerful." Jenny shook her head, stepping closer to him. "You're not just one person, Ethan. You're more than that. You've been given a gift, and you've already proven you can use it to protect others. Don't let them take that from you. Don't let them take you from yourself." Ethan's chest tightened with a mixture of fear and determination. He had been running from his past, hiding from the truth, but there was no running now. The Vanguard had come for him, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. But he wasn't going to let them win. "I have to do this," he said, his voice steady now. "For my brother. For everyone who's been hurt by them." As the days passed, there has been no movements from Vanguard. Ethan focused on his training, pushing his abilities to their limits. He needed to be prepared for whatever the Vanguard would throw at him next. He knew they wouldn't stop, not until they had what they wanted. But Jenny was doing her part as well. While Ethan trained, she delved deeper into the Vanguard's history, using her own skills to uncover more information. She was determined to help Ethan, no matter what it took. She knew there were more secrets to be uncovered, and she wasn't about to back down now. She spent hours in the library, digging through old town records, searching for any mention of the Vanguard. The more she uncovered, the more unsettling the connections became. Prominent figures in the town had ties to the group, some even seemingly endorsing their work. It was as if the Vanguard had been entrenched in the town's history, pulling strings behind the scenes for decades. One evening, Jenny stumbled upon an old newspaper article, its yellowed edges and faded print barely readable. It mentioned a series of disappearances from decades ago, all connected to a secretive organization. The article was short, but it gave Jenny the chilling sense that the Vanguard's reach was far wider than anyone could have imagined. As she pieced together the fragments of the past, Jenny realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. The Vanguard wasn't just an organization, they were a hidden force, manipulating everything around them to further their agenda. And now, it seemed, they had their sights set on Ethan. Ethan had always felt like an outsider. His abilities had set him apart, made him different from the rest of the world. But now, with Jenny by his side and a newfound understanding of his past, he realized that being different wasn't a curse, it was his strength. He had spent so long hiding from his powers, running from the truth of his past. But now, he couldn't afford to run anymore. The Vanguard was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Ethan knew that if he didn't act soon, they would succeed in their plan, and that would mean the end for him, for Jenny, and for everyone else he cared about. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. As he looked out over the town, his resolve hardened. The fight was just beginning, and he was ready. Ready to face the past, ready to take control of his future, and ready to protect the ones he loved. The battle against the Vanguard would be long, and it would be hard. But Ethan knew one thing for sure, he cannot black out now as he was in this deeply.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Masks and Mirrors, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 7, The Dawn of a New Mission. The sound of Ethan's footsteps echoed through the empty halls of his house, a strange comfort after the chaos of the past few weeks. The house was quieter now, the kind of silence that filled the space with reflection. The air felt lighter, but there was no denying the weight of everything that had transpired. His parents were seated at the kitchen table when he walked in, looking at him with expressions that were a mixture of relief and concern. They didn't speak immediately, but the understanding between them was palpable. Ethan took a deep breath and sat down, his fingers brushing over the edge of his mug. "I guess we need to talk," he said, his voice hoarse. After everything, it felt surreal to be in this moment, a moment of calm after the storm. His father, always the stoic figure, was the first to speak. "We knew, Ethan," he said quietly. His words carried the weight of years of secrecy. "We knew about your abilities. We didn't want to push you, but we were always prepared for this day to come." Ethan looked up, his heart pounding. "What do you mean you knew?" His mother placed a hand over his, the touch warm but heavy with years of unspoken truths. "You were never meant to be a soldier, Ethan. But we've always hoped you'd find your way on your own terms. You're not a weapon. You're not just your abilities." Ethan let that sink in, the truth slowly unraveling itself. His parents hadn't kept the secret from him out of fear or mistrust, but out of a desire to let him grow into his own person, free from the shadow of their expectations. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. "I didn't want this," Ethan murmured, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to be involved in this war. I didn't even know what I was running from half the time." The pain of his brother's death, the confusion of his powers, and the haunting presence of the shadow Vanguard had weighed on him for so long, it felt impossible to breathe without them hovering over him. His father nodded, his expression softening. "None of us want war, Ethan. But sometimes, the fight comes to you. And when it does, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be." Ethan's mind flashed back to the battle at the school fair, the moments of strategy and chaos, the clone fighting beside him, the faces of the innocent people he swore to protect. He realized now that his father was right. He could no longer hide from his destiny, no matter how much he wished he could. The room felt heavier as the truth settled in, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief. Ethan finally had the answers he needed. He was not just a product of his powers, nor was he a helpless bystander in the story of his life. He had a role to play, and it was time to step into it fully. His father's words broke his train of thoughts, and Vanguard is just a part of a secret society. There is one more group that does good than harm. I have already contacted them. You should have a chat with them. The next day, Ethan met Jenny at their usual spot in the library. She was already there, sitting at the back table, flipping through a book. As soon as she saw him, she closed the book and smiled, though there was an unspoken tension in the air. She knew now, everything. "Hey," Ethan said, pulling out the chair across from her. His voice was quieter than usual, but there was something different about the way he looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "Hey," Jenny replied, her eyes locked with his. "How's your head? After everything that happened?" "It's a lot to take in," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I'm okay. I guess I always knew things weren't normal, but it's different when you know the whole story, you know?" Jenny nodded, her gaze softening. "You're not alone, Ethan. You never were. I mean, I didn't know about all the secrets, but I knew you. And I'm still here." Ethan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He had been carrying this secret for so long that the thought of sharing it, of finally letting someone in, was both terrifying and freeing. "I can't ask you to keep this secret," he began, his voice low, "but I need you to understand. This isn't going to stop. The Vanguard." "I know," Jenny interrupted gently. "I've been looking into them. The symbols, the things you said. It's all connected to the Shadow Vanguard. And I want to help. I'm not going anywhere." Ethan exhaled in relief, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like forever. "I don't deserve you, Jenny," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "After everything I've kept from you, after everything that's happened, you still want to be by my side?" Jenny's smile was warm and unwavering. "You don't need to deserve me, Ethan. I'm here because I want to be. And I know you're doing your best. That's enough for me." There was a silence between them, a space filled with a new understanding. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But in that moment, it felt like they were both ready to face whatever came next, together. Later that day, as Ethan walked with Jenny out of the school, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking just beyond the horizon. The town felt different now. Calmer, yes, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Vanguard wasn't finished, but he was reassured by his father that the opposing group of Vanguard is active because of the school incident which made them lay low. As they walked down the street, he noticed something strange in the distance. On the town's water tower, a new symbol had been painted. It was subtle, almost hidden by the faded paint, but it was unmistakable. A new marking, the same as the one he had found at the school gym. The Vanguard was still out there, and their eyes were still on the town. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. Jenny, sensing his unease, turned to him. "What's wrong?" "Look at the tower," Ethan said quietly, pointing. Jenny followed his gaze, and her face went pale. "No, it can't be." Ethan clenched his fists, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They're not done. And neither are we." As the evening sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, Ethan and Jenny walked side by side. Jenny was happy she could spend more time with her crush, and immersed in the imaginary stuff she wanted to do with Ethan. The drone, unseen by the passing civilians, hummed overhead, its dark wings cutting across the orange sky. The two of them walked in silence, the soft murmur of the town around them nothing more than background noise. Ethan's thoughts were a whirl of calculations, of battles yet to be fought. But for the first time, he wasn't alone. Jenny was with him, and together, they would face whatever the Vanguard had planned next. Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. His viewpoint of the world had changed, and the stakes were higher now. But he was ready. Ready to protect his town. Ready to fight for the people he cared about. Ready to embrace the full weight of his destiny. He looked at Jenny, her determination mirroring his own, but there was also something he could not figure out. But he didn't want to pry, he only felt a deep sense of gratitude. With her by his side, there was no obstacle they couldn't overcome. "Whatever comes next," he said, his voice steady, "we'll face it together." Jenny nodded, a fierce glint in her eyes. Together. As the final echoes of their footsteps faded into the night, the camera pulled back to reveal the drone, now a speck in the distance, its mission far from over. But for Ethan and Jenny, the journey had only just begun.
Akumah Audiobooks.
"So you want me to go to his school and protect him?" "Yes. You know I only went to an all-girls school from my birth. I don't have any experience with boys, so why choose me?" "You will know in time. Good luck, Faith." For part 2 of this story, comment down below. The end.
Akumah Audiobooks.
This is the end of the story. For part 2, comment down below, and thanks for listening to my stories. Have a nice day.